In 2008, a team of archaeologists led by Ron Pinhasi was excavating a cave called Areni 1 in the Vyots-Dzor province of modern Armenia when they pulled a collapsed, dust-covered object out of a pit sealed beneath layers of sheep dung. Once conservators carefully reinflated it with soft filler, it turned out to be a single leather shoe, stuffed with grass, stitched from one piece of cowhide, and shaped almost exactly like a soft moccasin you could buy today. Radiocarbon dating put it at roughly 5,500 years old. Older than the Great Pyramid of Giza, older than Stonehenge, the oldest complete leather shoe ever found on Earth. And here's the detail that should stop you. It was in a good enough size to fit a small modern adult, sitting quietly in a cave for 5,500 years, waiting to overturn a very lazy assumption a lot of people carry around, that our ancestors just toughened up and went barefoot because they didn't know any better. That assumption is wrong, and it's wrong in a more interesting way than you'd expect. Quick note before we go further. If this kind of deep dive into how humans actually survived, the real mechanics, not the movie version, is useful to you, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment with a question about the human body you want answered. It genuinely helps this channel keep making these. This is Ken, and today we're looking at bare feet, ancient footwear, and the surprisingly sophisticated relationship between the human body and the ground beneath it, one that goes back millions of years before anyone stitched a single shoe. Start with a thought experiment, because it's worth sitting with for a second. Take off your shoes right now and imagine walking several miles today, not across carpet, across real ground, hot pavement, sharp gravel, cracked dirt, loose stone. Do it again tomorrow and the day after. No cushioned sole between your skin and the world. Most people's feet would be in open revolt within an hour. Blisters, cuts, bruised arches, burning skin on hot ground. So the question worth asking isn't some trivia footnote, it's genuinely strange. For the overwhelming majority of human history, people covered enormous distances with little or no footwear, and they weren't constantly falling apart. What did they know that most of us have simply forgotten? To answer that, you first have to understand that the human foot was never a passive slab of meat strapped to the bottom of your leg. It's one of the more sophisticated pieces of machinery your body owns. The heel absorbs the first shock of every step. The arch works as a dynamic structure, able to flex and stiffen at different points in the same stride, storing energy like a leaf spring and releasing it a fraction of a second later. The Achilles tendon behaves almost like an elastic band, banking energy on impact and returning a chunk of it on push-off. And the big toe sits aligned forward, in line with the rest of the foot, giving you a stable lever for that final shove that propels you into the next step. None of that makes feet indestructible. It makes them efficient. A foot is part spring, part lever, and, maybe most importantly for this story, part sensor. That sensing role is the piece people forget. A bare foot in contact with the ground is a constant stream of information heading straight to your nervous system. Texture, temperature, incline, the exact instant a pebble shifts under your weight. Your body reacts to that information before you're even consciously aware anything happened. Your stride shortens a fraction, your weight redistributes, your next footfall adjusts. Put a manufactured sole between your skin and the ground, and a meaningful amount of that signal gets filtered out. That isn't a flaw in shoes. It's precisely why they're useful, especially on ground that would otherwise be punishing. But it does mean that someone who grew up walking on real, varied terrain every single day was learning the ground in a way that most modern feet, cushioned since infancy, simply never get the chance to. This is where the biggest myth about ancient humans needs correcting. They did not have magically armored feet. What they had was knowledge, accumulated, embodied, constantly updated knowledge of the specific ground they lived on, which stretch of trail hid sharp scree, where thorns clustered low to the ground, which surfaces turned dangerously hot by mid-afternoon, how the terrain changed texture after a hard rain. That knowledge didn't require anyone to be superhuman. It required paying attention, the same way you instinctively slow down and take shorter steps crossing a dark room you don't know well. Ancient people were doing exactly that with the ground under their feet, except they'd had years of practice and so had everyone who came before them. The first physical layer of adaptation was skin itself. Repeated pressure and friction thickens the outer layer of skin on the sole, building calluses in the spots that take the most repeated load. This isn't armor plating. A callus is still living tissue, and it still transmits meaningful sensory feedback, which turns out to matter enormously. Losing all sensation in your feet would be dangerous, not helpful. You need to feel when something is too sharp, too hot, or too unstable, because pain is data. A bare foot landing wrong on a jagged stone gets an immediate, unambiguous message: shift your weight, don't do that again. That feedback loop can stop a minor misstep from becoming a serious injury before it happens. None of this means ancient people were somehow immune to getting hurt. They absolutely got hurt. Cuts, punctures, blisters, burns, infections, all without antibiotics or antiseptic to fall back on, which meant a small wound could occasionally become a genuinely dangerous one. The real achievement wasn't the absence of injury. It was the constant, practiced management of the risk of injury. Call it resilience rather than invincibility, because that distinction matters for understanding almost everything that follows. Every terrain, meanwhile, posed its own specific problem, and ancient people learned to read each one differently. Loose sand looks soft and forgiving, but it actually demands more effort, because the surface gives way under push-off instead of providing anything firm to launch from, which is one reason competitive sand running research consistently shows a higher metabolic cost than running on hard ground. Rock demands the opposite skill: careful, deliberate foot placement and constant micro-adjustment across an uneven surface. Dry, broken terrain hides loose stones and sharp fragments under a deceptively calm surface. And heat adds a layer entirely on its own. A sun-baked surface can run considerably hotter than the surrounding air, forcing the body to manage heat, pressure, and friction on the sole simultaneously. Ancient people couldn't out-tough that kind of ground through sheer stubbornness. They had to recognize it and respond to it. And often the response wasn't a physical adaptation at all. It was a behavioral one. Travel during the cooler parts of the day. Choose the shaded route when one exists. Take the longer path if it means gentler ground. Slow down the moment the terrain turns difficult. This is one of the most underrated truths about ancient survival in general. It wasn't a constant battle of raw toughness against a hostile world. It was mostly quiet, unglamorous judgment, knowing when to stop, where exactly to place a foot, which route was actually safer, even if it looked longer. That judgment started remarkably early in life, and it was never taught through lecture. Picture a child walking beside an adult across unfamiliar ground. Nobody hands a 5-year-old a survival manual. The child learns by direct, repeated contact with the world, which surfaces feel comfortable, which rocks wobble underfoot, which patches of ground turn scalding in the afternoon sun, where the earth goes soft and unstable after rain. They watch exactly where the adults place their feet and copy it, correcting through trial and error, thousands of tiny repetitions accumulating into instinct. The landscape itself did the teaching, and once that knowledge sat inside a person's body, it moved forward. An adult who knew the safest route led a child along it, that child grew up and led someone else, and the knowledge kept propagating through a community without ever touching a written record. That's also where group knowledge becomes a survival tool in its own right, arguably as valuable as physical strength. No single person needs to personally discover every hazardous patch of ground in a territory. Someone already has, and that knowledge gets shared. An elder remembers which route turns treacherous after heavy rain. A hunter knows which ground lets you move without giving away your position. A parent knows exactly where it's safe to let a child wander. A trader passing through seasonally remembers which path holds up best in a given month. The terrain itself becomes a form of shared memory, distributed across an entire community, refreshed and corrected generation after generation. Now here's where the story gets genuinely more complicated, because framing this purely as ancient humans went barefoot undersells what was actually happening. And the Armenia 1 shoe is exactly why. Humans have almost certainly been making footwear for an extremely long time. We simply can't prove exactly how long because the materials involved, leather, plant fiber, woven bark, hide, rot away in a matter of decades or centuries in most climates, while a stone tool from the same era can survive essentially forever. Archaeologists sometimes call this the missing majority of the material record. Entire categories of ancient technology, made from organic material, that left almost no trace precisely because they worked. Stone endures. Rawhide does not. That imbalance quietly distorts how the archaeological record looks, making stone tools seem like the whole story of ancient technology when they're really just the part that happened to survive. Where conditions were unusually dry or cold, though, organic footwear does occasionally survive, and when it does, it rewrites the timeline. In 1938, archaeologist Luther Cressman excavated Fort Rock Cave in central Oregon and recovered dozens of sandals woven from shredded sagebrush bark, buried beneath a layer of volcanic ash. Radiocarbon testing on similar sandals from the same region eventually dated them to more than 10,000 years old, meaning people in the North American high desert were already engineering woven footwear with a defined heel pocket and toe guard at the end of the last ice age. In the Nevada desert, sandals from Spirit Cave, discovered in 1940 and later redated using improved radiocarbon methods in the 1990s, turned out to be over 9,000 years old, among the oldest directly dated footwear ever found in North America. And in 1991, hikers in the Ötztal Alps stumbled onto the mummified body of a man who died roughly 5,300 years ago, Ötzi the Iceman, still wearing shoes built from deerskin and bearskin panels stitched around an inner net of woven bark cord, stuffed with soft grass for insulation. Modern experimental archaeologists who reconstructed Ötzi's shoes reported that they performed remarkably well as cold-weather, uneven terrain footwear, some describing them as more comfortable on rough alpine ground than a typical modern hiking boot. None of these people were struggling through the wilderness with nothing at all. They were engineering solutions to specific problems: cold, wet ground, sharp volcanic rock, long-distance travel over difficult terrain. Living traditions back this up just as clearly as buried artifacts do. The Rarámuri, often called the Tarahumara, live in the canyon country of Mexico's Sierra Madre Occidental, and have long been documented running extraordinary distances, sometimes well over 50 kilometers in a single day, across brutally rocky terrain, wearing huaraches, thin sandals cut from old tire rubber or hide, and tied on with simple leather thongs, offering barely more than a layer between the sole and the rock. Researchers studying Rarámuri runners, including work associated with Daniel Lieberman's Biomechanics lab, have measured their running gait and found it consistent with the same front-of-foot landing pattern seen in other habitually minimally shod populations. A stride mechanically tuned to absorb impact through the foot's own structure rather than through a manufactured midsole. On the other side of the world, in the Kalahari Desert, San hunter-gatherers have been documented by researchers including tracker and scientist Louis Liebenberg, practicing persistence hunting well into the modern era, pursuing an antelope for hours across sand and thorn scrub in the heat of the day until the animal, unable to shed heat as efficiently as a running human, collapses from exhaustion. That hunting strategy depends entirely on a body and feet built to move efficiently and read the ground correctly for hours without stopping. Neither the Rarámuri nor the San are relics of a vanished past. They're living demonstrations that the barefoot and lightly shod skill set described throughout this video isn't ancient trivia. It's a fully functional human capability that some communities simply never stopped practicing. That reframes the entire question. The interesting puzzle was never, why didn't ancient humans wear shoes? It's closer to, why did humans need shoes in the first place, and when did that need outweigh the cost of making them? Footwear wasn't proof that the human body had failed at handling the ground. It was technology, deployed selectively, exactly the way fire, shelter, and containers were technology. Fire changed what food could become. Shelter changed how much weather exposure a body had to absorb. A woven basket or a hide bag changed how far water could travel with you. And footwear changed the terms of contact between skin and ground, worth the material cost specifically when cold, sharp rock, or long, hard travel made the trade-off pay off. and skipped just as deliberately when bare skin, with its far richer sensory feedback, was simply the better tool for the terrain at hand. Cold climates pushed that same technology in the opposite direction. Inuit communities across the Arctic developed kami-eat, soft sealskin and caribou hide boots, sewn with waterproof stitching and lined with dried grass or fur for insulation, engineered not against sharp ground, but against a threat bare skin genuinely cannot survive for long: sustained sub-zero cold. Where the Areni 1 shoemaker and the Fort Rock sandal weavers were solving problems of terrain and abrasion, Arctic footwear makers were solving a thermal problem, and the design reflects it. Layered, insulated, airtight at the seams, built by people whose survival depended on getting that engineering exactly right. It's the same underlying principle running through every example in this story. Footwear shows up precisely where the specific environment demands it, and stays absent, in favor of bare or minimally covered feet, everywhere the trade-off doesn't clearly pay for itself. There's a deeper layer to this story that goes back well before any human sewed a single stitch, and it's written directly into the fossil record. In 1978, a team led by paleoanthropologist Mary Leakey at Laetoli in modern Tanzania uncovered a trail of footprints preserved in hardened volcanic ash, dated to roughly 3.6 million years old, left by Australopithecus afarensis, walking fully upright on 2 feet with a stride and weight transfer pattern strikingly similar to a modern human's. That's nearly 2 million years before the genus Homo even existed, and the feet making those prints already show a big toe aligned forward with the others, rather than splayed out to the side like an ape's, the same forward-aligned toe that gives modern humans a stable push-off point. Bipedal, ground-adapted feet are not a recent invention layered on top of an ill-suited body. They are ancient, foundational architecture, refined over millions of years of actual footfalls on actual ground. Much later, in 2021, a research team led by geologist Matthew Bennett published findings in the journal Science describing human footprints preserved in the gypsum mudflats of White Sands, New Mexico, dated using seed layers above and below the prints to somewhere between roughly 21,000 and 23,000 years old, among the oldest confirmed evidence of humans in North America, and notably, footprints, not stone tools. They show barefoot adults and children moving across a lakeshore landscape, some walking, some appearing to run, one set showing a child's footprints weaving unpredictably as if playing. It's a startlingly intimate record, not an assumption about how ancient people moved, but a literal frozen trace of their bare feet doing it. And there's real modern biological evidence backing up why the barefoot body held up as well as it did. A 2010 study led by Harvard biologist Daniel Lieberman, published in Nature, compared runners who grew up habitually barefoot against runners who grew up in cushioned shoes, and found a clear pattern. Habitually barefoot runners tend to land closer to the middle or front of the foot, generating a smaller, more gradual impact force, while shod runners tend to strike heel first, generating a sharper impact spike that the shoe's cushioning is specifically designed to absorb. Neither pattern is simply correct. They're 2 different mechanical strategies matched to 2 different relationships with the ground. Separate research on populations like the Dasanak of northern Kenya, led by researchers including Kevin Kraft and Nicholas Holoka in the late 2010s, measured plantar callus thickness directly and found that habitually barefoot individuals developed calluses substantial enough to meaningfully cushion impact forces, while still preserving far more sensory discrimination in the sole than a modern shoe allows. Evidence for exactly the balance this story has been describing all along. Real protection, without sacrificing the feedback loop that lets a foot negotiate with unfamiliar ground in real time. Other studies, including work on bone density by researchers like Angel Zeininger, have found measurable differences in the internal trabecular structure of the heel bone between habitually barefoot and habitually shod populations. Physical, load-adapted evidence that bone itself responds to a lifetime of walking on real, varied ground. There's an evolutionary layer underneath even that. A widely cited 2004 paper by Dennis Bramble and Daniel Lieberman in Nature argued that the human body carries a long list of features that only make sense as adaptations for sustained, long-distance running. a spring-like arch, an elongated Achilles tendon, an enlarged gluteus maximus that specifically activates during running rather than walking, and a nuchal ligament stabilizing the head that no other primate possesses in the same form. Their argument, still debated and refined by later researchers, is that early Homo likely used persistence hunting, the ability to run down prey animals over long distances in open heat until the animal overheated, even without matching a sprinting animal's top speed, as a viable hunting strategy, long before projectile weapons existed. If that's right, the human foot wasn't merely tolerating difficult ground. It was actively shaped, over hundreds of thousands of years, by the specific demands of moving across it efficiently, for hours at a stretch, in direct contact with real terrain. Bring all of that together, and a very different picture of ancient survival emerges than the one people usually imagine. Some cartoonishly rugged figure with skin like leather, wandering the wilderness immune to pain. What actually happened was layered and considerably more interesting. A foot shaped by millions of years of evolutionary pressure into an efficient spring, lever, and sensor. Skin that thickened where it needed to while still relaying essential information. Environmental knowledge built through direct childhood experience and passed forward through community memory. Timing and route choices that reduced risk before it ever became an injury. And running alongside every one of those biological and behavioral adaptations, deliberate technology, woven sandals in the Oregon desert, insulated leather shoes on an alpine glacier, a stitched moccasin buried in an Armenian cave for 5,500 years, deployed exactly when the trade-off made sense. Modern shoes didn't break that ancient system. They didn't make human feet weak in some simple, moralizing sense. They changed the mechanical environment those feet operate in, filtering out a huge share of the raw sensory information a barefoot ancestor relied on, while trading it for protection against surfaces, city pavement, broken glass, winter ice, that would have been genuinely dangerous without it. And the old machinery hasn't vanished underneath all that cushioning. Step onto cold tile barefoot and your body still reacts instantly. Step on a small stone and your weight still shifts before you consciously register why. That ancient sensing system is still fully wired in. Most of the time, your shoes are simply doing part of its job for you. So here's where that leaves the actual question. Ancient humans didn't survive difficult ground because their bodies were magically tougher than ours. They survived through a layered combination of things. Millions of years of evolved biomechanics, skin that adapted to repeated contact without losing its sensitivity, environmental knowledge built one careful step at a time and carried forward by entire communities, and, whenever the ground demanded it, real engineering, footwear built from grass, bark, hide, and sinew, solving specific problems the body alone couldn't. They didn't need to be immune to the world beneath their feet. They needed to understand it, closely and continuously, and know exactly when it was worth building something to stand between themselves and it. Tomorrow morning, when your bare feet hit a smooth, familiar floor, you probably won't think about any of this. Why would you? It's safe, it's known, it asks nothing of you. But for most of the time our species has existed, that same set of feet was reading real, unpredictable ground every single day, adjusting, learning, remembering, occasionally getting hurt, occasionally getting it exactly right, and eventually, when the ground demanded it, building something to help. We never stopped adapting to the ground beneath us. We just built something remarkable to put between it and ourselves. This has been Ken. See you in the next one.